Good morning. I'm Robert Daly. I direct the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States here at the Wilson Center. We're very glad to be joined this morning by Dr. Pek Koon Heng, who is with American University, where she is assistant professor at the School of International Service and also directs the ASEAN Studies Initiative. Welcome to the Wilson Center.
Thank you.
You're here this morning as part of our program on weighing the rebalance. And the goal of this program is to consider U.S.-China relations and U.S.-China cooperation and competition in the Western Pacific from the point of view of other nations in the region. We worry sometimes that if we only look at the United States and China, we tend to accentuate the adversarial, whereas it's multilateralism that helps us to look at in a more balanced way at some of these issues. And in this regard, Malaysia is in a unique position. It was the first Southeast Asian nation to establish diplomatic relations with China in 1974, and there's something of a special relationship there. But Malaysia also signed on to a new comprehensive partnership agreement in 2014 when President Obama visited. So could you tell us in a general way, from this special position, how Malaysian leaders, as well as the Malaysian public, looks at Chinese and American policy in the region?
Malaysia has managed to skillfully negotiate its relationship with China and with the US. It engages both, and that engagement is possible because of the overarching US-China engagement. And it's so crucial, that the US and China remains engaged. That makes it much easier for the region to then be able to manage China's rise in the region. So Malaysia, yes, you mentioned the comprehensive partnership. It's signed with the US. Malaysia signed a strategic comprehensive partnership earlier with China. And it has, as you said, the first country to establish diplomatic ties with China apart from the communist countries in the region. So Malaysia has a special relationship with China, and that has been articulated many, many times by the prime ministers of Malaysia and by the Chinese leaders. And in that sense, Malaysia plays this, as ASEAN chair, Malaysia wants engagement multilaterally with both China and the US, and Malaysia welcomes that multilateral engagement, first given to the region by China, and the rebalance is in a way, response to China's more earlier and perhaps more active engagement of ASEAN. And then the US came in knowing that it has got to catch up with China, and which is why it joined the East Asia Summit and signed the ASEAN Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. And so this has actually produced a win-win benefit from Malaysia's perspective for ASEAN, and also the rebalance to Asia and focusing on ASEAN has helped lift ASEAN's prominence, in the global stage of U.S. attention given to ASEAN, and bilaterally, it has also benefited Malaysia's ties with the U.S. and China.
But there are some concerns as well. China is Malaysia's #1 trading partner, but there have also been Chinese incursions or passages through Malaysian seas and Malaysia's exclusive economic zone, activities on the James Shoal. Malaysia is a claimant to some islands in the Spratlys. So when you try to balance these economic and military interests, especially with developments in the Chinese economy in the recent weeks, would you say that Malaysia is more concerned about a Chinese economic slowdown or about a Chinese military buildup in the area? How does it see those developments?
You're right, sort of under both these economic slowdown and the increased incursions in Malaysia's claimed territorial waters are sources of worries for Malaysia, but ultimately Malaysia understands that Malaysia's one of the world's one of the world's top open economies, and its trade to GDP is about 200%, and so. It has a very important plays an important role in the network of value-added supply chain in the region, with China being the central, the hub of this supply chain. But ultimately, Malaysia also understands that whatever it sells to China, whatever it trades with China, it's these intermediate goods that finds its final destination in the U.S. market. So the U.S. market is equally, or maybe ultimately more important. Everybody understands that with the slowdown in the U.S. economy will then will that bring about a slowdown in Chinese exports, and that affects Malaysia's exports to China. So both, there isn't an either or. It's very much both. It's so the trade is so integrated. This whole China-U.S. Interdependence is so great. That Malaysia doesn't see. So they see both China and U.S. having to work to deal with this hopefully temporary economic slowdown. And for the incursions in the South China Sea, this is a new source of concern for Malaysia. Malaysia has never been. It has played a very passive role as a claimant state compared to the Philippines and to Vietnam. But China's recent incursions has moved Malaysia perhaps more closer, to the U.S. in seeking defense cooperation, especially looking for U.S. assistance in training its Marine Corps. But at the same time, it doesn't want the U.S. to pursue an overly, an aggressive policy. Or it doesn't want the U.S. to go beyond a certain red line, that will provoke a Chinese response in the Spratly Islands.
You mentioned the importance of ASEAN. Are you confident that ASEAN has the degree of cohesion and efficacy that it needs to represent the interests and defend the interests of the member states? And do you see that ability changing at all when the chairmanship goes from Malaysia to Laos?
I think for me, it is not really a matter of how cohesive and united ASEAN is or can be, because you can't have that kind of unity because all these countries have such political and economic diversity. There's this huge range of political systems in the country, and all the countries have very pressing domestic problems. So for ASEAN, and the main reason of the major outcome that the ASEAN member countries want is for ASEAN to maintain peace and stability, not for the member countries to have the member countries resolve their disagreements peacefully. And so, in other words, to continue to provide a zone of stability in the region, so that each country then can pursue economic growth through their own individual bilateral policies. So the bilateral policies are more important in building their economic performance, and ASEAN multilaterally provides that regional stability. So that is the key to ASEAN. It's not about building an EU where you have got where there's this clear-cut identity with rules of law. ASEAN is informal. It's a process of managing intra-ASEAN, intramural conflicts, and so far it has worked.
We've spoken about security, we've spoken about economics. Let's talk a little bit about public perceptions. Malaysian attitudes toward China and the United States, their cultural influence, as well as their economic and security influence, and the soft power of both countries. How would you compare those? What are the public perceptions of the United States and China?
Well, as you know, Malaysia is an ethnically fragmented society, pluralistic society. It's about 60% Malay and about 30% Chinese. And so there isn't we can't generalize about public perception, because the Muslim population will look at the U.S. through its U.S. policies in the Middle East, and that has profound impact on the way the Muslim population in Malaysia perceive the U.S. And so far, especially after the Iraq War, it has not been very high, but it's doing better, and the rebalance has actually, improved public perception of the U.S. Although there's domestic opposition to the TPP, and that has, and I think the popular ratings of the U.S. stays at about 60%. It's not very high in the region. For China, China is more of a known entity to the ethnic Chinese. They're the ones who engage the Chinese a lot more in terms of business investments. There are very few, except for the state-led enterprises in Malaysia. There's very few public sector Malay engagement with China. It's overwhelmingly Malaysian Chinese engagement in terms of the going, in tourism or education and in investment. So it is, and I think China's public image has taken a fall with its increased activities in the South China Sea. Malaysia was probably felt that China, the rhetoric that China being benign power had more validity then. But today, with the incursions to Malaysian waters, China's image has taken a dent in the country.
Dr. Heng, thank you for coming to the Wilson Center today. We hope that you'll come back soon.
Thank you for having me.